The Esperia Blade is a replica of a Vandal combat ship, and it's the only Vandal ship available for purchase in-game. In patch 3.17.2, the Blade was updated with more agility and a better loadout, with a full set of laser repeaters. And the result is an outstanding combat ship that's the best light fighter in the game for PvE bounties, and maybe even for PvP. I mentioned in my 3.17.1 tier list that the ship might be A tier after the updates, and now I can confidently say that it definitely earns a spot near the top of the A tier. So let's get into it. As a light fighter, the Blade doesn't have the highest DPS or shields of all combat ships, but it does have good DPS and absolutely ludicrous agility, which helps you stay alive and apply your DPS by helping you stay on target. In this group VHRT mission, we're against a Warden, a Valkyrie, and 2 Hurricanes, which means there's going to be a lot of incoming DPS. I ping the scan to check for asteroids before accelerating quickly towards the Warden. I use the bottom thrusters of my ship to quickly slow myself down in a good position directly above the Warden, which gives me a large surface area to land shots on and also helps ensure that my shots will actually be registered against the target. The positioning pays off and we get a quick first kill. Usually against many enemies you'll want to be very mobile to avoid incoming fire, and because we didn't maneuver around, we did lose half of our shields. So we put the power to shields to top them off before going after one of the Hurricanes, which is close distance to us. Here we can see the size 2 shield hit registration issue, where the damage against the ship is often applied only to the back shields, so we really want to position above, below, or behind the target when possible to help land effective damage. After the kill, we quickly find the Valkyrie on top of us, but the Hurricane isn't far, and it's a much more fragile target, so we choose to go after the Hurricane first, strafing to the right side as it passes us on the left to try to open up the angle and keep it in front of us as it tries to joust us. We succeed in keeping it in our sights, but we don't want to be head-to-head against it because it's got more shields and damage than us, so we use our higher agility to turn the fight into a pitch battle, by strafing down and pitching up. Normally we'd want to use our stronger bottom thrusters and strafe up, but the Hurricane has a really powerful turret on top, so it's better if we can get underneath it. We take high G-forces and start blacking out a couple of times, but it lets us secure the kill with only mild shield damage. The G-forces don't do any permanent damage, so it's okay as long as you come out ahead in the combat. We recharge our shields until the remaining Valkyrie lands a shot and cancels the charging. In 3.17.2, Valks are now the tankiest VHRT enemies, taking the title away from Hurricanes from previous patches. So we'll want to do our best to get a position above or below it while rolling and strafing around it to avoid incoming fire from its many turrets. We use our stronger bottom thrusters to strafe up and get a good position so the Valk struggles to get its nose on us, which lets our shields passively recharge while we keep our capacitor to full weapons. Even though its front shields haven't registered any damage, we can see our shots lighting up the hull in the back since we've positioned ourselves in an ideal spot above it. We'll rotate around to keep using our stronger bottom thrusters to help with our positioning, and it isn't long before we secure the kill, even ending the battle with more shields than we started with. I wanted to show another instance of combat where we really use the mobility of the Blade to full effect. We speed towards the target until we're about 10k away, and then we check all the enemies to see how much incoming damage we're dealing with. Hurricanes and Valkyries are the most dangerous because their turrets can track you pretty well even with high agility. So if you have a lot of them, you'll want to fly more evasively and watch your shields more closely. Here our target is a Warden, which is the least dangerous VHRT target, and it's a pretty fast kill if you can get above it, so we speed into our 1.5k range, and then maneuver around it to get shots on the top or bottom of the ship. As we strafe around the target, you'll see even though we're facing the front of the ship, our shots are arcing around it and hitting the top of the ship, which helps us land effective damage. Hitting the top or bottom of the ship helps ensure that the hits actually register damage and we secure our kill. So far we've been fighting in space, which has no atmospheric drag. So here we're going to take a look at some combat against a Hurricane on Daymar, which is a moon with a much higher level of drag compared to many other moons, but still not quite as much as a planet. Since the Blade is a light fighter with only 2 size 1 shields, its agility is a large part of its defense. On a moon or planet with atmosphere, you have less agility and are less maneuverable, so light fighters like the Blade lose a lot of their defensive capability. This means that you need to keep a closer eye on your shields and be ready to run away to recharge them if you're taking a lot of fire, like what just happened to us right here. Shields have a 5-second lockout period where they don't recharge after taking damage, but once that period is done, your shields will recharge in 4 seconds with full capacitor, so So you don't want to go too far away from your enemy because the NPC size 2 shields take about 5 times as long to recharge, so any extra time it takes you to get back into the fight is extra recharge time you're giving them. To help avoid incoming damage from the wingmen, I also changed my flight mode to decoupled so that my ship continues floating along its path unless I specifically apply thrust in another direction. This helps to avoid enemy fire by maintaining a higher average speed at the cost of my movements being less precise, since it often takes longer to change direction in decoupled flight when you're at the speed limiter. But fortunately we still have enough control to get good position over the Hurricane and get the kill. Now let's show an instance of combat where our mobility was limited because the target stayed really close to the moon's surface. This makes it really challenging because you can't easily pitch battle and strafe circles around your target, you have to rotate around them above the ground to avoid their incoming fire. In this instance I try my best to stay above the target and try to keep them near the edge of my range between 1 and 1.5k away. My goal is to get them to try to joust past me to give myself some additional altitude to work with, while peppering them with fire along the way. I'm also constantly pinging the scan to light up the ground and help keep myself oriented, which is tough in the darkness. And anytime I get an incoming missile alert, I just fire off a decoy or two which sends the missile away from me, so that I can keep focused on my target. You could also maneuver to try to avoid missiles, but decoys work so well that there isn't usually a need to right now. I finally succeed in getting them to fly up and past me right as I finish them off and get the kill. Now here we've got the Blade on the planet of microTech, which has a dense atmosphere which is going to severely limit our maneuvering. We're fighting against a Warden escorted by a few light and medium fighters. In planetary atmosphere you could consider taking out the light fighters first since they'll be able to consistently chip away at you while you're fighting the main target, but the Warden is a weak enough enemy that will just go straight for it. We are going to struggle to get a good position on top of or below it since it can pitch over to face us much faster than we can maneuver our entire ship around it, but we keep trying to get under it anyway. We're taking a bunch of damage from the light fighter escorts, so we'll have to disengage to recharge our shields before getting back on the Warden. You can see that even disengaging takes longer since our acceleration is so much lower in the atmosphere, but eventually our shields are recharging and we turn back around to find that the Warden is already in range. I choose to go underneath it, thinking that the gravity would help pull me down into a good position, but I also could have used my ship's stronger bottom thrusters to try to get above it. My decision pays off though, and we get a clean look at the bottom of the Warden, which is what we needed to land damage for the kill. Since the escorts are right here and they're quick kills, I decide to pay them back for their affection. The Saber is a pretty squishy ship, so it goes down pretty fast once I get it lined up. I lock up the Freelancer Miss next, but they're a tankier target, so I'm just going to leave them alone and instead go after the Gladius, which should be another quick kill. Revenge is oh so sweet. I also wanted to talk a bit about the Blade's performance in combat assistance service beacons now that they're a bit more available. Unlike VHRTs, the combat assistance service beacons require you to kill all the enemy targets, so you often need a ship that's capable of taking out lighter ships as well as heavy ships. Here we're in a moderate threat beacon, which happens to have 3 light and medium fighters, but it could have also had something like a Valkyrie. The Blade is great for these missions because they all take place in space, so there's no atmosphere to slow down your maneuvering, and you've got the agility and firepower to hunt down light, medium, and heavy fighters. And you need to be able to do that reasonably efficiently because most of these missions require you to protect a stranded ally, and the only real way to do that is to kill the enemies before the enemies kill your dead weight, client. It actually turns into a bit of a fun and relatively profitable shooting gallery while you're in this ship, so I'd highly recommend picking up low and moderate threat beacons when you're in the Blade. Here we're in a high threat beacon, which I don't really recommend in the Blade because they'll often have really tanky ships like hammerheads which can kill your client before you can finish them off. But I wanted to show you that the Blade can efficiently dispatch Valkyries as well as the light fighters. Valkyries are really tanky, so it's very important to get a position above them to land and register damage. I shot past this one a little bit, but it's fine because it lets me hit them from a different angle. Also, being in space without any nearby asteroids to worry about crashing into lets you focus more on your positioning and aim, so you're less likely to take damage so you can keep your capacitor to full weapons for a more efficient kill. And that's just really satisfying, especially in this ship. I just love the way the guns look, sound, and feel. They feel like they're firing ballistics even though they're laser weapons, which is the best of both worlds in my opinion. But combat beacons have some issues too. They often will have untargetable enemies that you need to kill, which forces you to turn off your ship and turn it back on so that you can target them. This leaves you vulnerable for 5 to 10 seconds while everything powers on again and your shields come back up, so that can be a problem for a light fighter, but if you start flying in a random direction before power cycling, you can avoid taking fire. Just beware any missiles heading towards you. You also occasionally have to fly around to get enemies to show up, but hopefully that'll be fixed soon once the signature issues are sorted. These missions are still a lot of fun and pay pretty well, even with their payouts lowered. Now I want to talk a bit about the ship's weapon loadout and how it's changed. The Blade has 2 size 3 and 2 size 2 weapon hardpoints with fixed laser repeaters unique to the ship that can't be changed. In the past, the size 3 Warlord plasma cannons fired at the slower 700 meters per second cannon speed, and they also did a mix of laser damage and distortion damage. The size 2 Wasp laser cannons actually fired at the 1400 meters per second laser repeater speeds, which is what they still do, so they haven't changed. But what this meant is that in the past, weapons didn't have the same projectile speed, so you had to lead your shots by different amounts for the different guns, and that made the ship really hard to use effectively. Now all the guns are laser repeaters and can be aimed together, which is fantastic. There are some bugs though. There have been a bunch of times where my size 2 Wasp guns didn't reload ammo, even though the capacitor is set to full weapons like you're seeing here. Moving the capacitor around doesn't really fix it, and it's usually in the middle of combat, so I can't spend the time to go into the weapons MFD to turn the guns off and on individually. But fortunately, they'll usually start working again automatically in under a minute. If anyone knows a more immediate workaround, please let me know and I'll pin a comment. It's a nuisance, but it doesn't happen often, and honestly, for how the guns look and feel while firing, I'm okay with it. Another thing that's really worth mentioning is the cockpit setup. Due to the red on black theme and the red backlighting, it can be really difficult to see certain things such as the damage state of your ship or your target, or reading where enemies are on your radar, which is on the bottom middle of the cockpit if you haven't noticed yet. The rings on the radar represent how far out the enemies are, but it's very difficult to make them out due to the red backlighting. I get that it's meant to be thematic, but I really hope they find a way to keep the vibe of the ship while making the interior more usable. It is nice that we can see 4 MFDs though. The last consideration I wanted to talk about was the mobi-glass usage inside of the Blade. If you open up the star map while you're in the cockpit of the Blade, part of the UX is cut off and you won't be able to set or clear quantum routes while in the cockpit. This is because the Blade has a bit of a strange seating position. It's sort of like you're on a motorcycle rather than in a typical pilot seat. And since the mobi-glass is projected off your wrist, it ends up being closer to your face in the Blade because of that seating position. The way to work around this is to quantum to places while you're in orbit of one of the planetary bodies. Here we're in orbit of Crusaders, so we can see quantum markers for all the other planets and Lagrange points in Stanton. If we were at one of the moons, we'd only see the markers around Crusader space, so quantum to your planetary body and you'll get all the other markers. Sometimes the planet that you'll want to go to is behind the planet that you're at though, like we can see here with ArcCorp behind Crusader. So we'll have to instead manually quantum away to one of the other bodies outside of Crusader space and cancel quantum warp, and then we can go to the other planet. This can be a bit of a nuisance, and it isn't a perfect solution since if you have overlapping targets, it can be a pain to actually lock onto the one that you care about, like we see here with Hurston. But I suspect most people flying the ship won't be doing too much interplanetary travel with it since it doesn't have any cargo or storage space. The fit of the Blade has a bunch of locked options, so there isn't too much up for debate here. The guns and missile racks are locked, so the only real choice is whether you want Pioneer or Task Force EM missiles, since EM missiles have the best chance of hitting the target due to all the ships having large EM signatures. Personally, I don't think it matters too much. Task Forces look cooler on the wings, but Pioneers seem like they're more consistent, so I just go with them. For the shields, you'll want Grade A Industrial Palisade shields because they have the same recharge rate and shield hit points as all the other Grade A shields, but they have more ballistic damage protection. By design, ballistic damage penetrates shields, and the Palisades I'm recommending here let the least ballistic damage through the shields while they're still up. We have more than enough power, so we don't need to change the power plant, and we don't need to change the coolers either since they won't improve our performance. Lastly, for the quantum drives, you can put on the Civilian Voyage or Atlas drives since they're the drives that can travel the fastest between the planets of the verse on a single tank. There is a caveat though, since the ship comes with competition grade coolers on it, which means they'll have really low component HP. When I did 20 VHRTs in a row on the Blade, I did actually have one of my coolers get damaged, but I literally turned off the damaged cooler and the ship still ran perfectly fine, so you don't need to change them, but if you wanted to, you could equip military spec coolers for more component HP. Now let's talk about how the Blade stacks up against some other light fighters that you might consider using. I'm going to show the profiles of these ships while we're talking through this, since for light fighters a large part of their defense is avoiding incoming fire, and the shape of your ship plays a big part in that. I'm also going to show a representation of a central point of the ship where someone might be aiming, and a representation of the spread of where those shots could land to help drive home how the shape of certain ships help or harm them. The Anvil Hawk has the highest DPS light fighter in the game right now, but it has some serious handicaps in terms of a fragile hull and some pretty poor maneuverability, with the Blade having 20% more body and nose hull HP and being able to pull 50% more G-forces and acceleration. The boxy shape of the Hawk doesn't do it any favors either and makes it a relatively easy target. I still enjoy using it, but I think the Blade is better for VHRTs despite the DPS difference. The Gladius and Arrow are the Blade's closest rivals in terms of performance and role, and the Blade has more DPS and agility than either of them. This is offset by the Blade having a lower body and nose hull HP, although it's still pretty durable. It's got twice the shields of the Arrow and the same shields as the Gladius, but the shape of the Blade makes it so that there's a gap between the body and the sweeping wings where enemies could aim and miss their shots, whereas the Gladius has a much more typical shape with a center point that enemies can aim at and have most of their shots still catch the rest of the body. I think this helps make the shields last a little bit longer on the Blade, but obviously that's anecdotal. But even if things get spicy, you can lose a chunk of your wings and still have all your weapons and not lose much maneuverability, and repairing your ship when you've lost some wingtips is really cheap, costing only a few hundred Alpha UEC. The Mustang Alpha is actually a pretty good light fighter. It's not as precise as the Gladius, Arrow, and Blade, but it's very agile and has decent firepower that can be gimbaled for no DPS loss. Thanks to its boxy shape though, the Mustang feels less tanky than the top three since it's easier to hit that larger front-facing profile. The Avenger Titan and 325A are on this list just to give reference points to upgraded starter ships that have higher caliber weapon hardpoints, but it's no contest with these ships. The Blade blows the Titan and 325A out of the water for combat. Lastly, the Cartual and Talon are really fun ships to fly, but they've both got the same issues: size, fragility, and DPS. They're really large for only having two size 1 shields. The Cartual's front-facing profile is the size and color of a barn, and the Talon's top-facing profile is the stuff gunners' dreams are made out of. And thanks to only having two size 4 weapon hardpoints, they actually end up with a pretty low DPS in the current state of game balance. I haven't really spoken about the missile loadouts of any of these ships because missiles don't do a ton of damage and you run out pretty quickly when you use them across a lot of bounties, but the Blade is on the lower end of the spectrum with 8 size 1 missiles, just beating out the Mustang, Hawk, and Cartual, which don't get any missiles. Lastly, you can't really talk about the Blade without talking about the price. At almost 3.4 million Alpha UEC in-game, it's almost 3 times the cost of the Gladius and 3.5 times the cost of the Arrow, and its performance isn't anywhere close to being 3 times better than the other two. It's even a lot more expensive than the other alien ships like the Talon and Cartual. But if you've already got your basic set of ships, or you really love light fighters, or if the styling of the ship just speaks to you, I think you won't be disappointed to grind this one out. I'd hesitate to buy it with real money because of the $275 price tag, and because we don't know where its effectiveness will land after more weapon balancing and armor is implemented. So I bought mine in game and I'm definitely going to get it again after the next wipe because I love flying it even despite its flaws. In many ways it's kind of like Star Citizen itself. It's incomplete, a bit buggy, it can make you black out, but can also make you feel things that none of its competitors can and keeps you coming back. That's all for the Esperia Blade, folks. Thanks for watching. I hope you've liked this video, and if you want to hang with me some more, come visit me on Twitch. I'll put the link in the description. Cheers.